Rise Up and Run. Stories of deliverance and transformation through the power of Jesus Christ that allows people to rise up from bondage and run in freedom. I'm your host, Janice. We are back with another episode of Rise Up and Run, and my guest is Amy Landers Kearney. If you listened last week, you were probably a little shocked and surprised about her story, and yeah, it's pretty crazy. So when we left off last week, she, as a 17-year-old, had just been released from Rikers Island. Mm-hmm. Yep, Rikers Island. And so, yeah, take it from here.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Here we go. It's good to be back. We did. We were released that Saturday, and I ran out to the payphone, called my best friend, told her I had just gotten out of Rikers Island. We were both in disbelief. I had to explain, yes, biggest prison, biggest county jail all in one in the United States, a scary island in one of the boroughs of New York. And so I then hung up and called my mom on a collect call. And I think the first things out of my mouth were, "You know where I've been, don't you?" And she said, "No, but I have my guess." And I said, I think I blew her socks off when I said I was just in prison, Mom. I was in Rikers Island. And she immediately started crying, and I asked, could I come home? And she said yes. And so that sparked a process. We had to wait until my dad was released a couple days later. One of his supporters actually put their house up, and we returned to North Carolina. My mom had started working with a local DHS officer to get me home through Interstate Compact, which simply meant that DHS would pay, since I was a runaway, to bring me home. So long story short, they got me an airline ticket. I waited at the Raleigh-Durham airport after being picked up by the police, which we had set up. I went for a walk, and the police picked me up. My half-sister, again, Ashley, was with me, and ran home, got my dad, and I'll never forget sitting in the back of the police station and hearing my dad argue to give me back to him. And it was my choice to leave. I could have stayed. I just knew that if I stayed, it probably and would have gotten worse, and that my dad wasn't going to be free for very long. I knew in my heart that anti-government, sovereign citizen things that he was doing would end him in prison. I knew that. I didn't know the extent of how long that would be, but I knew it. So I go to the airport. The police take me to the airport, and my ticket wasn't ready. So I sat and spent the first night in the airport, and I had nothing with me. And so I ended up calling my dad and telling him I wanted to go home, but could I have some of my stuff? Could he bring me some of my stuff and some money, because I didn't have anything with me? And so he did, and he came to the Raleigh-Durham airport and pulled up with his wife and the other Dana that was with us in New York. And it was awkward because they had a couple bags packed, and I still to this day don't know what happened. And it's kind of a dim memory in the back of my brain somewhere, but I remember him saying, "Just jump in and grab your bags." And I don't even know if I wrote about that in my book, but my stepmom was getting angry because I wouldn't. The other Dana was saying, "Just get it. If you want them, just jump in and get them." And
so you were afraid?
I was thinking they were just going to take me, and not to hurt me, but just to say, "Amy, you don't have to leave." I think my dad wanted me with him, and I wouldn't. I stood my ground, and I stood outside, and I just said, either just give me my bags. And so my dad ended up grabbing my bags out, and we had a conversation about where my airline ticket was, and I just kept saying, they told me I just have to keep checking at the desk. All of that was a protection that I didn't get the ticket and sell it. So they were waiting on the ticket to clear right before my flight. And so I found out I would call my mom sporadically, and she said it would probably be tomorrow. So I had already spent a night in the airport. There was a hotel in the parking lot of the Raleigh-Durham airport, and my dad said he would get me a room. So we walked together. The other Dana came with us, and my dad and I walked And we got into the hotel lobby and I was crying. And I said to him, I looked him in his face and I said, Dad, just come with me. Let's run away. You have endless money. Leave all of this behind and let's just go. I don't want to go without you. And he was crying. And he said he couldn't. That he needed to fight for the country. And so we hugged. I continued to ask him. He paid for the room, or Dana, the other guy, got the room. They handed me the key and they left me. I just remember him walking away and how bad that hurt me. And he knew that. I think he was just so wrapped up in what he was doing. I went to my room and I fell asleep without getting under the blankets. I remember falling asleep on top of the covers. When I woke up the next day, it was good I had my stuff. I had some makeup. I threw myself together, went over and waited a few more hours, and then my airline ticket was there. And they flew me from Raleigh to Chicago and Chicago directly to Waterloo. And I remember back then there wasn't as much security. And I remember landing that little plane on the Waterloo airport. And I could see my mom and my brothers waiting for me. And so I got off the plane and ran to them. And it was so good to see them. It was so good. I felt safe again. And not that I didn't feel safe with my dad. It was just the chaos around my dad.
You were a dearly loved girl.
Yeah.
By mom and dad.
Yeah, very. Yeah. And so I came home shortly after I had my son. When I was 18, I was just turning 18, and I had my son, Alex, who gave me a new love for life. And I knew I had to be better for him. And so I went on, I started school, ended up graduating by taking classes. My best friend and I did it together. Ended up graduating and going on to Hawkeye Community College. I started taking the criminal justice program. It really intrigued me. I would still talk to my dad. He, for a while, was a little upset that I left, but then kind of understood. And one day he called and said he was leaving North Carolina. He was going to help some people in Montana. And so he took his motor home that he had purchased, drove from North Carolina to Montana with his wife. And he had given me a phone number to a house in Montana. And I didn't really think anything of it until I was at my best friend's house and breaking news came on TV that there was a standoff, an anti-government standoff starting in Montana. And it crossed my mind, and I remember talking to Angie about it, and she was just like, no, we would probably know if it was him. And then sure enough, we found out it was him in the standoff, that the FBI had surrounded this 960-acre ranch, and there was 22 or 23 anti-government extremists in there refusing to surrender the land that hadn't had taxes paid on it.
Okay,
Yep.
that makes sense.
Yep. And so a couple of the owners, there were several houses on this land. I mean, the driveway was 2 miles long and it was huge. There was, I can't remember how many houses, 2, 3 or more, and a lake. They had generators to last for a long time. And basically what had happened was when my dad got there, they had arrested 2 of the owners of this ranch, and my dad basically took a sheet of paper, posted it at the end of this long driveway and said, if you come in here, we're armed. And it started the standoff. And so as a college student, my younger brother was actually starting college and at the University of Northern Iowa, and in his history class, because the standoff had just started, he had talked to his professor about it. They ended up spending the entire semester talking about the standoff and watching CNN and MSNBC and Fox News because it was always on the news.
Okay, did everybody know that was his
Yes.
dad?
Yeah. And that was intentional.
That kind of embarrassing?
No, he wasn't. He thought it was pretty cool at the time. I'm not sure, because he brought it up, and then that's what they would talk about, is these sovereign citizens and just different things in that class. And it turned out to be to be really neat. And so that was happening, and the standoff ended up lasting 81 days. And in those 81 days, I would get home from school, I would stick a VHS tape in the VCR, and I would record everything that came on. I would go between news channels and I would record. And then they sent in a guy by the name of Randy Weaver, who had his own standoff years before this. Randy was a friend of my dad's, and he actually went in and tried to help this group of people come out. Nobody wanted it to end.
Because Randy Weaver, wasn't he in a standoff and his wife
Yes,
and son were killed?
his wife and son were killed years before, and that was
Yeah.
at Ruby Ridge.
Yeah,
Yep.
yep.
There had also been Waco had happened years before. And so the FBI was they did an amazing job at being patient with the Freemen. I know it was frustrating, and there's actually a recent documentary on PBS about the Montana Freemen standoff. It actually is interesting because it goes prior to my dad even getting there, but how it started and the distrust that this group of people had in the government, leading to them not paying their taxes. But it was on PBS Montana. It's called the Montana Freemen, I believe. But it was very interesting. I watched that not that long ago and learned about the backstory of the Freemen. And my dad basically just heard of these people through Dana, his wife. She knew them. They wanted my dad's assistance in how do we get out of paying these taxes. And my dad was a very brilliant person. He was very intelligent. And so he went to help. And the standoff lasted 81 days. At one point, the FBI came to my mom's home, and we made a videotape. Alex was a baby in a stroller, and my mom made a sign and hung it to the front of Alex's stroller that said, "Please come home, Grandpa," or "Please come out." And then I did a majority of the talking and just looked him in the face, looked him in the camera, and just pleaded with him to come out so that nobody got hurt. After 81 days, they came out. It came on breaking news. It happened to be June 14th of 1996, my older brother's birthday. And they came out, and thankfully nobody was hurt. Again, the FBI did an amazing job of being patient with them when they didn't have to be. They had shut off the electricity, and they had tried different things. But they came out peacefully, and that day, I'll never forget thinking, oh, it's over, when really it was just beginning.
It was.
Yeah. And so that takes me to learning about my dad's incarceration and learning what it was like to have an incarcerated family member. If you don't have an incarcerated family member, there's things that you live with every single day that other people are completely oblivious to. He spent years in a county jail in Montana. I think it was 4 years before he got finally sentenced. My attorneys have actually looked at everything, and the federal sentencing guidelines, he was supposed to have 6 years or 70 some months. And because he was uncooperative in the courtroom, they basically threw the book at him and sentenced him to over 60 years federal time.
How old was he at this time?
He was 46.
Okay.
Yep. When he was sentenced, when the standoff happened, he was 46. So his first stop 4 years later, I hadn't seen him, although I had talked to him on the phone when he was allowed time. He had flown to North Carolina for charges. They had flown him to Oklahoma for something else. They had flown him to different areas where he would be held for days on end and then go to court in North Carolina on several occasions where I wouldn't hear from him for a month. So that's kind of torture when your dad is incarcerated and you don't even know where he's at. Mm-hmm. So that kind of started all of that. But then he ended up in El Reno, Oklahoma, El Reno Federal Prison. So 4 years I hadn't touched him. I hadn't seen him. I chose not to fly to North Carolina to go to court. I just didn't. I didn't go to Montana. I would just everything I heard was basically from him as of what happened. And my mom agreed to take myself and my younger brother, Mike, and Alex to El Reno. And so we drove the 12 hours, and I soon learned how scary of a place prison is for a family member. I mean, you pull up and the barbed wire fence or the truck driving around the perimeter, or going in and having them take your hands and rub a sheet of paper on them to look if you have drugs on your hands, all which is necessary, but it's very scary. And with my history and what had happened in Rikers, a door closed behind me and it scared me. And so we got enough courage to walk through those doors, and I will never forget. They told me what table to sit at, and a little bit later, you quickly learn what door the inmates are coming out of. And so I was intently watching that door, and when I saw him, I jumped out of my chair and started running to him. I didn't know that wasn't allowed, and I was screamed at, almost to the point I was embarrassed. And here I was 20 years old, 21, 22 years old, and I just put my head down and I walked back, and my dad came right to me and we hugged, and it was a very emotional hug because now here we are. It's very different from the last time I saw him at the Raleigh-Durham airport, and we spent that entire day together. It was 8 hours, an 8-hour visit, which was so good and so wonderful. And as things progressed with him and his incarceration, I didn't realize how much of a luxury that was to sit on those hard chairs or to be able to go to the vending machines. I would get Mountain Dew or Cheetos for myself and for Alex, and my dad, a majority of our visit was talking about all the bad chemicals in a can of Mountain Dew, and he knew them all. He knew every chemical. He knew what it did to your body. We would talk about stuff like that. We would talk about, he would go off into his extremism, and I was learning and had learned over time how to redirect those conversations and talk about Alex and his spunk for life, or Mike would share about different things. And so that was one of several visits where you just learn how hard it is to sit for 8 hours across a table from someone and keep conversation going. As bad as you miss them and as much as you love them, how hard those moments are.
Did he ever give up that way of thinking?
No.
Never.
No, it did get less extreme in the last 5 years. Yeah, the last 5 years. And so he knew he had a long road, and he actually continued his anti-government stuff there. In the meantime, my older brother, Ryan, who had just wrote him his first letter. Ryan was a little different in that when my dad left, he was already in high school and on his way out the door to be a student at the University of Iowa. And Ryan wrote him a letter, and it was one of the most beautiful letters I think I've ever read, because he talked about my dad leaving, and he talked about what that did to our family. He also talked about having several jobs at a restaurant and coaching baseball for Mike. And he said, but stepping into your role, I felt was something I needed to do, Dad, and I did it. And Mike is growing, and he's an amazing young man. He stands on that home plate and hits a triple without any hesitation. And this letter was just beautiful. And at the end, he said, I forgive you. I forgive you, though, Dad, and I'm sorry it turned out this way. And shortly after my dad received that letter, Ryan was tragically killed in a car accident, and on his way skiing. Ryan had graduated from the University of Iowa and was working on furthering his education. He had gotten his BA in political science. He was brilliant and wanted to be president one day. And he was in grad school at the time he died. And so having to call your dad and go through the process of getting a hold of your dad and proving that your brother was just killed when you're in a fog was something that I wouldn't wish on anyone.
Why did you have to prove it?
I had to prove to the prison so that I could talk to him. And so I did. I had them call the sheriff's office, and they confirmed everything. And they told me to keep my phone open at 7 o'clock that night, which I did. And they luckily had my dad with a minister when he called, and he was devastated.
You had to tell him, or they told him?
I told him. They had just told him that there had been an accident and that he needed to call home. And so he was devastated. But in that time that he had now been incarcerated, Ryan died in 2000. My dad had been in prison 4 years, or incarcerated 4 years. My dad really learned or went back to what he knew, and that was his faith. It started from the minute my dad went to prison, and not that it had ever went anywhere. It was just more, he was intentional about his relationship with Jesus. He just was. And so the day we could have paid to have my dad come to Ryan's funeral, and we chose not to because of the spectacle that could have created. We would have had to, it would have cost a lot of money. And so during that time, he talked a lot about how he felt when he knew the funeral was going on, how sad he was for my mom. And this was his son too. And so he spent that time in prayer and worship during the funeral and prayed a lot for my mom that he wasn't there. I think he felt guilty for the first time that he wasn't there. And then he was just kind of left alone. And that bothered him that night, the night of the funeral, how he was alone. And he really just needed somebody. So he turned to Jesus, and that's what he knew to do. And so Ryan passes away. And then shortly after that, the years keep going by. He's incarcerated. I continue to visit. And my grandpa gets sick and has cancer, his father. And so against the wishes of my dad's siblings, and rightfully so, I don't hold them against them at all. They didn't think my grandpa needed to ever go visit my dad, that it would be too hard, but he wanted to. And at 88 years old, if he wanted to, I was going to make it happen. Mm-hmm. And so I loaded my grandpa up from the assisted living house that he was at, and we went on a drive, just him and my mom and Alex and myself, and we drove to El Reno.
And this was a drive.
Yeah, 12 hours.
12 hours. So
and so for him,
like, oh, I went and visited my dad. This isn't like a afternoon trip.
Right. It was a 12-hour drive. I got to spend that time, and I'm so today thankful for that time that I was able to spend with my grandpa. And I'll never know if it was the right thing to do for sure, but in my heart I do, because that's what he wanted. Going in there, he knew that this was saying goodbye to his son. He knew, and he talked about that. He knew, well, he didn't talk a lot about it. He more talked about how unfair it was. He felt that my dad was over-sentenced. He felt like his crimes didn't fit the time, and he was very vocal about that. But going into that visit and waiting and pointing to the door and saying, "Grandpa's coming out of there," and watching my grandpa as my dad walked out, and here it was the first time he had seen him in how long? The standoff had happened. On his way to the standoff, on my dad's drive from North Carolina to Montana, he stopped at my grandfather's house, saw his parents, and took his guns with him. And so my grandpa, that was the last time he saw him, but really never forgave himself and felt like he played a role in the standoff. And there were several conversations where I had to remind him that just wasn't true. It would have happened regardless. So I knew what the end of the day or what the end of a visit looked like. I knew that the lights flickered 10 minutes before, and I knew you had to say your goodbyes, you could give a hug, and then my dad would go to the back of the room, and we would go to the front of the room. And throughout the day, throughout that visit that day, I remember them talking. I remember moments of silence where they would just look at each other. And I knew what was coming. They both knew what was coming. My grandpa just didn't know what it looked like. And then the lights flickered, and we started to pray. My dad prayed, I prayed. My grandpa, if I remember, said a few words. My grandpa was raised in the Lutheran church, and we hugged. I remember putting my hand on the back of my grandpa and my hand on the back of my dad, and there were so many tears. And I remember thinking, Lord, how do I help them say goodbye?
Because he knew.
They knew, yeah.
They weren't going to see each other again.
Yeah, that it was an official goodbye. And so, again, the only thing I knew to do was to pray. And so I did. I was even at that moment singing or humming. They hugged each other. They hugged each other again. When you have a loved one incarcerated, for me, I always thought I need one more. So I'd always go back for one more hug. I would always go back for one more just pat on the back before I walked out. And this time I had to just one more, like my grandpa would turn around and just one more hug. And my grandpa goes to the back of the room. We go to the front of the room. And my grandpa was broken. He would just stare, and it was too hard for my dad to look, although he would turn and look. My grandpa was sobbing so loudly that I had both of my hands up and I put them on his back, and I was just talking to Jesus, just singing, and basically having to kind of push him to go out of the door as he waved one last time with both hands. He turned and waved, and we got to the car, and my grandpa cried for quite some time. That was a very tough moment.
Oh, it was hard to read about.
Yeah.
And to hear about it. So did they have words of reconciliation or forgiveness?
Yeah, they did. And I think that my grandparents, as hard as it was and as embarrassing as it was at times when he's on the front page of the paper or he's on headline news and he's still somebody you love. And I have to go back to, if you think about that person that you, when you were a child, that you were so close to, that was your world, that relationship doesn't stop because he went to prison. And for Grandpa and Grandma, that didn't stop. They still loved him even through the embarrassment.
Well, and he was still their little boy.
Yeah, their only son.
When you said they were looking at each other, I'm just like, was he thinking, I remember when you were 6.
Yeah.
Ugh, I remember
it's horrific. It was horrific. Yeah, that was a tough one.
We talked earlier about how maybe your grandpa was thinking, what did I do wrong?
Yeah.
Why did I, did I mess up somehow to let him to this? Just a lot of big feelings going on that day.
I was the daughter, and everybody in this story had a different relationship with my dad. Every one of them, for the first 40 years of my dad's life, had a pretty positive relationship with him. So it was such a shock that we were even in this situation. It
didn't make sense.
None of it made sense.
So here's my question. Did you ever challenge him and say, Dad, you're such a follower of Jesus. What about submitting to authority?
Yeah.
What about that?
He had a saying about that he believed that there was evilness. He believed that there were a lot of smoke and mirrors going on, and that because there you are to submit to authority. And I don't remember his exact words, what he would say, but he had something to say about it. Or even the divorce thing, or you're with another woman, or leaving your children. Like that, if you'd have asked people that knew him, any of them to this day, did you ever expect him to do any of those things? They would say absolutely not. Like the neighbors of my mom's are still her neighbors today. They were all friends with my dad. Like nobody believes it. It's so weird.
Just, and I told you this before we started recording, that I found myself feeling a little PO'd.
Yeah.
Torqued at your dad.
Yeah.
That he would just continue this. Because I think I don't want to say glossing over things.
Yeah.
His imprisonment was it was a burden for you.
Yeah.
And you couldn't live like a normal life, happy-go-lucky, enjoying things, because it was always something with your dad that was coming up. And I was like, man, can you just behave so your daughter can have a life?
Right. There's a lot of people after they read my book that have actually felt that same way. And the only answer I have for that is 2 things. One, he was my daddy and my best friend. And secondly, I forgave him. I really had to dig deep. And it was seeing him in prison and seeing you're paying the consequences for what you did, for leaving, for hurting my mom, for hurting my brothers, for hurting me. This is the reality of your choices, Dad. And so it was very apparent to me that, when I was being naughty, he forgave me. Mm-hmm. And he taught me what forgiveness looked like. He really did as a little girl. Whether it was fighting with my brothers or, even when I started to kind of go off in the wrong direction, he reminded me of whose daughter I truly was, and that he forgave me for not coming home. I forgive you for not coming home last night, but don't do it again. And I would just move on. I always knew forgiveness. And so I think the Lord had so gently prepared me for that, because a lot of people think, I don't know if my dad did that. I don't know that I'd be sitting there going to visit him. For me, it was easy. And it's really weird.
It's hard to understand that.
Yeah.
Because I was feeling a certain way.
Yeah. Yes.
Well,
You and a lot of people.
It was just
I
like,
didn't
come
expect that, but a lot of people have felt the same, and felt the same not only against my dad, but that feeling for my mom. Like, this lady went through it.
Did
Like,
she ever remarry?
no,
Oh,
nope. And that was intentional. She believes she had a shot at marriage, and it didn't work. And my mom loves to travel. We call her the cruise queen. And when she hears this, she'll laugh. She has a great group of amazing friends. They were all retired teachers or their retired principal, and they travel together. And that's what she loves. She's like, I guess I wasn't made to be in a marriage, and that's okay. I like that. I'm fine. I'm happy. So yeah, she never remarried. So yeah. So that's that. Going along, a few years later, I had my second child, Ben. And at 14 days old, I took Ben to meet his grandpa. I took Alex along. Alex was in kindergarten, and took Ben. And at 14 days old, it's not often that somebody that's incarcerated holds a baby like that, let alone your grandchild. And so there's actually a picture in my book. He described that day of the best day he'd had in years. And in one of our last visits, he still talked about that day of holding Ben and looking at him and having Alex be jealous and saying, "Can I sit on your lap, Grandpa?" Oh. And Alex was always such a great entertainer in those still, soft, quiet moments of visits where you're just kind of lost for words. Alex would have something to say. And so there's that picture, and Ben is brand new. And so all of that happens. And I cherished those visits, even though some of them got to be long. And if I would have known what was to come, I would have cherished them even more in those moments. Because one evening my dad called me and he said, "Well, I'm back in the news, Aim." And And so I said, "What do you mean? What's going on, Dad?" And he said that he had gotten in some trouble for filing a lien, and it would be considered a fictitious lien, against the warden of El Reno Federal Prison. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing?" This is one of those moments where I just said, "Can you just stop, Dad?
Can you just be normal?
Just be normal, Dad. Just pull it together." And he said, I didn't do anything wrong. I just told him basically that I want out of here, and me and these other people. And so he said, "It's probably on the news again, but I got in trouble." So I'm like, okay. That evening, I happened to go to my mailbox. And I believe he said he had sent me something, but I can't remember. But I go to my mailbox, and there's this big package from my dad. And I set it on the couch. I was watching the news, just waiting for something to pop up. I had called my mom, told her, "Dad's back in the news again." And that evening, sure enough, it came on CNN that he was being charged with extortion. So he's getting another charge. And before I went to bed, I opened this package. It was probably 10 o'clock at night. And I opened this package, and there was 2 envelopes inside the package. And come to find out, after figuring out what I was holding in my hands, it was the deed to the warden's house. And so I immediately called my mom.
Wait a minute.
Deed.
How did he get that?
I don't know. What I do know,
it the abstract?
It was like a deed and an
package.
abstract. It was a bunch of stuff.
That? Oh,
I have
Lord.
no idea. It was addressed from him.
Oh my goodness.
So I called my mom. It's 10 o'clock at night, and I don't know how it is today, but 20 years ago, there was an FBI office in Waterloo, but it wasn't like a 24-hour office. So it directed me to Omaha, I believe. And 10 o'clock at night, somebody answered. I said, hi. At this time, I never said this, but I was the director, an executive director for Blackhawk County. I was running that youth shelter that I was in as a child. After working there for several years, I had became the director. So I was the director of the youth shelter, and I have a warden's information in my hands. So I call the FBI office. They said, at the direction of my mom, because I was kind of at a loss of what to do. And they said, okay. And I just said, yeah, this is who I am. This is who my dad is. I think I might have the warden's information in my hands. And within 15 minutes, there were 2 agents at my door to get the information. And you have to remember that I felt I was betraying my dad because I didn't want him to get in more trouble. Like, that would have been the worst. He's already got 60 years. But I did. I felt it was the right thing to do. I never told him that I did that. And sure enough, he gets sentenced to more time. And then I happened to write a letter I sent it to the warden, and I had just said, hey, I sent it to the warden and his counselor, I believe, because I just thought, what has happened to my dad? And I really wanted to get to the bottom of it. So I thought, well, did they do any assessments with him? Did they do a psychological examination? Did something happen to him? And so I wrote this probably 3-page letter, kind of giving the history of my relationship with my dad, my family unit, and all of those things. And then I just said, I think something's wrong. I don't know if there's a mental illness. I don't know what's going on, but if you could give me information. I know there's a release of information signed with me in the prison, and nothing. I got nothing back. And next thing I knew, it was going on. I can't remember the time, so I don't want to say, but it was a long time that we were going between phone calls. And because of that, what he did with the warden and the lien, he was in the hole for quite some time. And so that's another reason. That was another reason that I wrote the letter. Like, can we look at this? Because I don't think he needs to sit in a hole for this long. And I sent the letter, and then next thing I know, I have a call with my dad, and he asked me, do I think he's mentally ill? So against my wishes, somebody shared the letter with him. And next thing I know, I sent the letter to a couple of our state senators and just said, hey, he's been in the hole for a long time. I'm talking at this point, maybe over a year. It could have been longer. I don't remember. But so I was looking for help. And next thing I knew, he was being transferred. And he was transferred to McCreary, Tennessee, to McCreary Federal Prison. So I immediately jumped in my car and went to see him, because for that time he had been in the hole, I couldn't see him. We would get maybe 1 phone call a month. And so I jumped in the car, went and saw him. He was still being a little defiant, because he said an FBI agent had actually came to the prison to talk to him about some things, and he refused to talk. We still, throughout this one visit, we prayed. I asked him, Dad, can you just let stuff go so we can work on getting you home and you can restart life? Like, I think you're learning, Dad, that you're not going to change things even if you're right. And he would, at this point, kind of teeter-totter, which he hadn't before. And that visit was probably, it was the last time. If I knew this, I would have held on forever, but it was the last time I would touch him for 11 years, because he was then transferred to a terrorist unit in Terre Haute Federal Institution, a terrorist unit with about 50 or 60 inmates that are highly classified as United States terrorists. There was a lawsuit against it at the time. I did a lot of research, and there was a lawsuit against the Federal Bureau of Prisons at the time, because they were only holding Muslim people. And so in talking with somebody from that institution, I was told, well, your dad was brought in as a balancer to help with that, because he was a United States citizen. He was not Muslim. And so he was brought in along with a couple other guys. This unit was very strict. It was lockdown. It was, you had to have permission to talk to anybody on the phone. So you couldn't just call a family member. They had to do a thorough background check. So the only people my dad could talk to, and you only got a couple people on your visiting list and your phone list. So it would have been myself, my brother, and my mom was on it, and my kids. And he couldn't talk to like his great aunt or anybody. And so I jumped in my car, went to see him, and quickly learned how terrible of a place this is for anybody. You had to schedule your visit 2 weeks in advance, and you didn't go into the prison visiting room. You actually walked around to the old death row building that was falling apart, went through several locks to get in, and you're seated in a small room that you could basically reach your hands out across and touch the walls, and a big piece of glass in between you and a phone. And so those visits were really tough. You only got 2 hours. And if you drive 6 hours, for me, that drive and to sit behind glass for 2 hours, it was really hard for me. And I had no idea how long this would go on. I thought it was temporary. And unfortunately, it wasn't. So the visits that I did have, you know how you see in the movies when people touch the glass, and that's real. That's very, very real, because that was as close as I could get to him for 11 years. At year 11, after visits, we learned our relationship was hearing each other's voice. And there was an old movie. The little mouse in the movie's name was Fievel. And I can't think of it.
I know what you're talking about, but I can't think
Yes,
of it.
An American Tail.
Okay.
And my dad and I had seen that when I was a little girl. And in the movie, there's a song that they talk about, it helps to think you're sleeping underneath the same big sky. And we used to say that to each other. And so even though we couldn't be by each other, we couldn't touch each other, it helped to know that we were under the same sky, that we were under the same moon. Or there'd be times where he'd say he had a 5x7 window that had been scratched really bad so that you couldn't see out of it, but he could see the shadow of the moon. And so he would talk about that. He would talk about his 7x10, and it was his war room. And so we had a lot to talk about. We would be on these phones across from each other in the glass. And in this moment, I would throw in there, just remember your person. And this was my person on the other side of this glass that never had a victim. He didn't hurt anybody. He wouldn't hurt anybody, and I knew him better than anybody else. And the things that he would talk about, he talked about one day, it was funny, the food that he was getting every day, they had the same bologna sandwich, and there was a piece of cheese on it. And he said the cheese literally tasted like wax. And he said, I get 2 hours out a day in this area that the top of it's covered in a fence. And he said, but I took my cheese out because these cats come up to the fence. And he goes, I had to stop doing it because I thought they're going to charge me with animal cruelty because it's wax. It's not really cheese. So these are some of the stories, some of the things that he would tell me. We would pray together. While he was in the CMU unit, that first 11 years, he got 2 scheduled calls. He'd have to schedule them a week in advance. And if something came up or there was something going on in the unit and you missed your scheduled time, you just didn't get the call. So then we'd have just 10 minutes a week, or sometimes it would be a whole week. I quickly learned if I'd go a week or 2 and didn't hear from him, I'd call the prison and talk to his counselor just to be sure he was okay. And then, so the CMU unit was very rough on him. He called it his war room. He talked about putting his locker up on styrofoam cups because there was black mold coming from the wall. Again, this was the old death row building. He never went into a lot of detail, but I'd get a letter every week for 25 years. And in some of those letters, with not a lot of detail, he was afraid. He was afraid of some of the people around that would come out during the 2 hours because they didn't like him because of his beliefs. And so I would pray specifically for his safety. And about 11 years in, I didn't hear from him. A week went to 2, 2 went to 3. I hadn't seen him in about a year. The last time I had tried to see him, my middle son, Ben, came with me. He had just turned 16 the day before. He had only met his grandpa or touched his grandpa as a 14-day-old child. And we get there and we're getting checked in, and they said, oh, he can't come in. And I said, oh yeah, he can. He's been on the visiting list. He just hasn't been able to come. He's a child, he's 16. And they said, yeah, he turned 16 yesterday. He has to have a full background check. And I'll never forget the look on Ben's face, because he was so defeated, because he wanted to just touch his grandpa, just see his grandpa. And so he was denied. I asked to talk to a supervisor. It was denied as well. And so he never got to go in. Luckily, he was 16 and could go drive to the mall. And so he did. So little things like that just crushed either my children, or they saw what it did to me. That was just kind of concerning. And then we're about at year 11, and again, he didn't call. 1 week turned to 2, 2 to 3. I called the prison. I was told he was okay, but they couldn't give me any information of when he would call. And then this got to be, it was approximately the mid-November, and he finally called. And he said his best friend had been murdered when they came out for their 2 hours. I think his name was Robert or Roger. He had been murdered by ISIS. And he said, do you know who ISIS is, Amy? And I said, yeah, Dad, I've heard of them. And he just said, they're very mean people, and they killed Roger. And he was very upset. He said he happened to be in his cell during this 2 hours. He was using the restroom when he heard a commotion in the cell next to him, which was another person. Because of the commotion, he quickly finished using the restroom and came out to see his other friend laying in a pool of blood and had been stabbed several times. So he ran in and started CPR. And he did see 2 guys running down the hall, and at this time he had no idea about Roger. He didn't have a clue. Later on, long story short, I believe I wrote a lot about it in the book, but he was scared. He was very afraid. He was 70 years old at this time. And he found out through the investigation that this group of people had a list of people they wanted to kill, and he was the number 1 person on that list because he led a Bible study on the 2 hours time he had out in the caged area. And so that happens. Some time goes by, and one day I get a phone call. It wasn't at 5:30 on a Tuesday or Thursday or Monday or Wednesday night, whichever time frame it was at that time. It was like in the afternoon. And I answered the phone to the usual, this call is from a federal prison. And I'm like, well, that's weird. And he said, Amy, it was him on the other line. And he said, I'm out. I'm free. And for a second, I was like, whoa, Dad, where are you at? Like, what's happening? And he was out of the CMU unit. And he said, Amy, I can see the sky for the first time in 11 years. Wow. And at that moment, I really realized what this 11 years had done to him. By this time he had been in prison probably 20 almost, 15 to 20 years. But this time, 11 years, he said, I get to go to the track. I can take my shoes off and walk in the grass. I haven't touched grass in 11 years. And just the things that he was saying, I was really soaking it all in. And at the same time, I was talking to Jesus like, thank you, Lord, for giving him this opportunity. That was taking a toll on him, and losing his friends really took a toll on him, and he was afraid. And so I jumped in my car and immediately went to see him. And my daughter and I actually I had never been in that visiting room at Terre Haute. And so I've learned where the door was, and out he came. And because it had been some time since our last visit, since he was behind glass, I noticed a change in his physical appearance. In fact, his collar, he had a yellow jumpsuit on. His collar wasn't fixed right, and he just looked so lost. And again, he was 70 years old, had just done 11 years in 22-hour lockdown, no physical contact, just all of these things. And so I said, Dad, here I am. I walked with him to the front of the room to check in. They told me the rules at that time that I would have to hug him there. So we hugged, and he was so brittle. He got to hug Ava, my daughter, that I had for the first time, and we sat down. He sat very protected, and what I mean by that is he had his legs crossed, his arms crossed, and bent over like he was protecting himself, which to me spoke volumes about his mental state. That visit finished, and it was a great time. 11 years and not getting to touch your person, it brought back some life to me. And I knew at this point it would be a good idea to start fighting for him. Like, he'd been in long enough. He didn't get in any trouble in years at this point. And so I contacted an amazing group called FAM, which is Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and just created a relationship with these people who would come into play later in the story, but just started reaching out, seeing what our options were. And a few weeks go by, maybe a couple months, and then again, no phone calls. And he was calling 10 times a day sometimes just because he could, and he hadn't had that opportunity in so long. In fact, he'd call and I'd be like, oh, great, here we go again. Okay, Dad. And we would laugh, we would talk. It was like we had a normal relationship. It was so weird because how bad the relationship was, or how difficult, not bad, it was just having a relationship over the phone and through glass. This was just great. So then here it is, no phone calls. And I'm like, oh no, something's wrong. A week goes by, a couple weeks go by, I call, I get no information. And so now I'm worried, is he alive? Is anything, like, what's happening? And then one day, probably a couple months later, and I continued to try and call. You just learn to do that because you don't know if something happened or what's going on. I got a call, and it was him. He said he was in the hole, that they had done a room search in his room, and on a yellow sheet of a legal pad, he had drawn a picture of a check, and they found that. And so he had been put in the hole. He had been given discipline. He said he didn't remember, and I really didn't have a reason not to believe my dad. He was very truthful through all of everything, at least even what he believed. It may not have been true, but he believed it. And so he said that he had been told he was going back to the CMU unit. And so off he went. A few weeks later, he was back in CMU, our scheduled calls, visits behind glass. And then the ending of the story is pretty much this. Those years go by. Year 13, COVID started. So it was March. My family, we go on cruises every spring break, and we were headed to a cruise, but it was canceled because of COVID. And again, I had talked to my dad every week for the last 24 years, and something was different. He was coughing a lot on every call, and he would get very frustrated. We decided, instead of going on the cruise because it was canceled, we just got an Airbnb. And I'll never forget leaving on that trip. There was probably 15 of my family. We're at Chicago O'Hare Airport. It's spring break week. It's crazy. And my phone rings. And on the other end of the phone, I'm standing in line to get pizza with my daughter. And on the other end of the phone was the most horrific voice I had ever heard. He was gasping for every single breath. And when I say every breath, I mean every breath. I could hear him say help. I could hear him say he was in the hole. I just kept hearing help, and I handed the phone to my daughter, and I said, Ava, what is he saying? What is he saying? And she was like, I don't know, Mom, I don't know. I fell to my knees, and I don't even remember doing this. But what I do remember is I started to pray. Again, I didn't know anything to do. I didn't know how to help him. I couldn't reach through the phone. I couldn't run to his house and fix him because I couldn't get to him. So the only thing I knew to do in that moment was to start praying, and I did very loudly. And he had taught me that. It was him that taught me that. And so I did. I was asking for the Lord to breathe into him so I could understand him. I heard him say COVID, but I wasn't sure. So this was a Thursday afternoon. The phone ends after 5 minutes. I told him I would be calling senators. I would be calling by this point, I already had attorneys working on a compassionate release for him. I would let them know something was going on. I would call it the prison. I was calling everybody. So I did just that. I was shaking, and I started with the prison. I didn't get any answers. I just said, could you tell me, is he died? Like, he couldn't talk, he couldn't breathe. I didn't get any answers. I crossed my mind several times to get on a plane to Indiana instead of heading to Fort Lauderdale. And so when I got to Fort Lauderdale again, I started calling. Friday comes, nobody would answer. In fact, there were times nobody would answer at the prison, which was horrific for somebody wondering what's happening. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, I finally get a call from an amazing person who happened to be the unit manager of the CMU unit. And he basically just told me that day they had taken my dad to the hospital and he wasn't well. Because of security, he couldn't tell me if my dad was still at the hospital or if he was back at the prison, but that somebody would be in touch with me in the next 24 hours. So we had a long conversation, but it didn't answer any of my questions because he couldn't. And so the very next day, I was sitting on the beach watching my cousin's parasail. I didn't set my phone down. I never let it out of my hand because I couldn't breathe myself. Like I was in such a fog. I spent a lot of time on that trip with the Lord. I sat on that beach while everybody was enjoying themselves, talking to Jesus, and my phone rang and it said Terre Haute. And so I quickly answered. My dad's counselor was on the other end and said, Amy, I have your dad with me and he wants to talk to you. For security purposes, we ask that you don't say, but he is in the hospital. And we asked that you don't tell anyone that, and I assured them I wouldn't. And my dad got on the phone. He could breathe, but he was very frail and very weak. And he said, Amy, I have cancer. I was wetting my pants. I couldn't button my shirt. I can't see. But they said it started in my kidney and has spread to my lungs and my brain, and I have 33 tumors on my brain. I didn't even know he was sick. I knew he was coughing, but he protected me from that. And he knew that he was very sick, and he knew that I had filed for compassionate release or was in the process. And if for people that aren't aware, compassionate release just means you ask the courts to re-look at their sentence, to look at somebody with terminal illness and say, he's done his time and let him go. And so in that moment, I was repeating what was being said, and my aunt, my uncle, my mom were surrounding me, and I just fell back. I was sitting at the edge of the water, and I laid there, and I knew what that meant. And so I assured him I'd be calling his attorney. Her name is Kat, out of North Carolina, where his largest sentence was. And we finished the call. Everybody talked to him. They assured me I'd still get my 2 10-minute calls a week. And I asked, could he talk to my brother too? And they said yes, they'd have to split our calls in half. And so I immediately called my attorney, and by 4:30 that day, our compassionate release was filed. And filed in one of the districts in North Carolina. And so what that meant was a federal judge would see that, and the government would then have 10 days to respond. And so my attorney was very adamant and very sure that, he has a terminal illness. He obviously does not have long. And so I asked, she asked, can you go see him? And I said, I don't know that they'll let me, but I'm going to do everything I can to see him. And so I get home from Florida and immediately drive to Terre Haute, if only it was to sit in the parking lot of the hospital, and I didn't even know what hospital it was. So my best friend Angela and I got in a car, and we quickly named our parking lot parking lot prayers, where we sat out there and we prayed, and we listened to some of my dad's favorite music, Neil Diamond and Dan Fogelberg, and we prayed. We were in contact with the prison. I was very upfront that I was there, and I begged and pleaded with them to let me see him. And they let me know that just wasn't allowed with a CMU inmate. And then one day they called and said I could see him. So I did. I got to go in a secret way and for security purposes, and had 2 guards in the door and my dad's counselor in the chair. And my dad's favorite person in the prison was the minister who met me for my visit. We were able to do communion together. We did a lot of praying. I could see how frail and how sick he was, but we both had a lot of hope that the compassionate release would go through, and I assured him that I would get him home. And so through all of that, I left that day. The Lord gave me peace that I would see him again. And so I left that day without losing it. I thought I would. And I was able to get to my car before I cried. And they began treatments with him, not chemo, but they started a new thing with him, even though there was like a 1% chance it would make any difference. They gave him about a month to live. He knew that. We'd talk our 10 minutes, and I would update him on anything I knew. And then Ange and I decided to come home for a couple days. I was told that the government responded asking for an extension. The federal judge said, no, I need it on my desk today. And so they did their response, and my attorneys made it very clear it would be very hard to read, that they're going to make him look as bad as they feel he is. And so don't be discouraged by that. But the fact that the judge didn't give him an extension is a good thing. They know how important it is that we get this going, that we expedite the process. And so I ran home. In the meantime, my brother was given a visit, a 2-hour visit, so he also went, and they were able to say their goodbyes. My brother was able to tell my dad to his face that he forgave him, because they didn't have that relationship. Their relationship was just different. They would talk a lot less frequent than my dad and I did. They didn't write letters. My dad would write to him. My brother didn't respond, which is okay. That was what Mike needed. And so I came home, and my attorneys needed an update. We had subpoenaed all the hospital records. The judge was going to make his decision. And so I wanted to be back in Terre Haute, but I wasn't there yet. And I needed to update our attorneys, and they asked me to get the doctor on the phone, which is nearly impossible, because even though my dad signed a release of information, it was only for certain things. And to get a doctor to respond to an inmate's family it wasn't their top priority. So I was able to, with some great people's help from the prison, get a phone call scheduled at noon on a certain day. The doctor called me right at noon as scheduled, and I was greeted and told that he had a massive seizure the night before and was no longer responsive. And so that crushed me in that moment, because now it's too late to get him in the car after 13 years of solitary confinement and 24 years in prison. It was too late to get him in the car, and I knew that. I pleaded with the doctors, can you let me see him? They said it wasn't up to them. I panicked. I called my mom, I panicked. I called my brother, and they knew how serious and desperate I was. And my brother actually got a hold of somebody from the prison, and through lots of phone calls was able to get me a visit, one more. And so we got there together at 9:30 at night. There were several guards that came in for overtime just to allow us to do this, who I'm eternally thankful for. We walked to the end of the hall, and I'll never forget coming around the corner and seeing my brother at the foot of my dad's bed with his jaw down, because we had just seen him 5 days before at our visit. And he was completely unresponsive. His head had been shaved, and he was very alone.
Why?
We don't know. Nobody would tell us, but his head had been shaved. He had a large wound in the top of his head that I still don't have. I don't know what happened. And the most amazing thing happened in those moments. Saying goodbye to a parent is never easy. But in this moment, knowing that my time was limited to say goodbye, I immediately started touching him. I was rubbing his head. I was rubbing his hands, trying to make him comfortable. I was whispering in his ear, telling him I was there. I asked one of the guards in the room with us if I could turn my phone on and play some music. And he said, do whatever you need to do. And so I set my phone next to his ear, and the first song I played was Run for the Roses by Dan Fogelberg, which is his favorite song of all time. And tears started to fall. And so he was hearing that from him. He heard it, and he was trying to mouth the words. And so I knew he could hear me. And so I kept talking, I kept praying. I told him I was still fighting, and that I would never stop to try and make things right. And my brother teased me in the meantime, stop touching him, Amy, what are you doing? And I wanted to see his feet. I wanted to see the shackle to the bed.
Still shackled to the bed?
Yeah. I asked if it could be taken off, and they said no. And so, and you got to remember, he couldn't walk, he couldn't see, he couldn't hear much, he couldn't see much. Like, when you have 33 brain tumors, everything. In fact, I have writing of his where before he was taken out, he was writing downward on the page. His beautiful handwriting was lost. And so I prayed with him. My brother whispered a few things to him, and he moved his head. He tried to open his eyes, and one eye opened. And the last word to ever come out of his mouth was Jesus. That's the last thing he said. And so I said my goodbyes. My worship music was playing after the Dan Fogelberg song. And I turned to say goodbye. I kissed him on his forehead. I got to the door. I turned around, and I needed just one more time So I got back to him, I kissed him, I hugged him. I told him I was going to bring him home, that everything had been filed. And I got to the door again, and the guards were crying, and I needed one more, so I went back again. I don't know how many times I went back, but Mike and I left that night, and him and I spent that night at a hotel. He was planning on leaving in the morning, and I was going to stay because I was just going to be in the parking lot. I just needed to be there.
I remember you posting all this on Facebook.
Yeah,
What was going on?
yeah, and I did. So that morning, I got a call at 7 a.m. from our attorneys, and they said the judge was going to make a decision that day. And they said, if we need you to be ready, because it's a 6-hour process to release him from federal custody on a compassionate release, it has to go through this place and this place. And so just be ready, be there, don't leave, because you need to get him with you, even if that means moving him to the regular part of the hospital so you can be with him. All I wanted to do is lay next to him and hold his hand, sit next to him, play his favorite music, and be with him as he went home. At this point, it wasn't about him anymore, it was about me. He didn't know. He was already on his way there. And so she said, just be there. I'm going into court, but if we hear anything, my assistant will email you of what next steps are. So Mike said, I'm going to run home. I'll be back. And so I said, well, I need a car. So we went to Enterprise, rent a car. And as I'm walking in the door, I get an email. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Mike, this is it. The judge made a decision. And I'm literally standing with the door propped open. Mike's next to me. I'm holding my phone and I'm shaking so badly I can hardly scroll on my phone. And I open it. It's from my attorney's secretary, and it is from the judge. It's a court order. So I'm like, oh my gosh, here it is. They're releasing him. And it said, it was a court order, and it said, I am recusing myself from the case. A new judge will need to be appointed. And this was after decisions had been made for over a month of no, they don't get an extension, of getting the records every day. I want an update from the doctor. And instead of making a decision, the judge recused himself for whatever reason. I'll never know. I literally collapsed in the doorway of Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and my brother had to pick me up and take me out to the car. He cried, I cried. My attorneys got out of court because she saw it. She called, she was crying, and she said, I don't understand. I can't explain this to you, but I've pulled out a card I've never used to get a new judge immediately to make a decision. We followed all the rules, we did it right. He meets all the requirements. And so my brother took me back. We drove back by the hospital. He said, let's just go home. You know, he probably has a few days left. So I agreed, and I'm not sure why I agreed. I think I was so distraught. And we drove home in silence. I continued to play on repeat the song Praise You in the Storm, because it was the biggest storm that I had ever been in. And so we drove home. That was on a Wednesday, and a new judge was appointed on Friday, and he died the next day. I know he didn't win in court, and I know that he didn't ever get out of prison. But I've been able to live with it because I knew he really won in the end, because he's where he wanted to be. And he made that very clear, where he wanted to go. And he knew his father through all of this. He knew he was never alone. He knew the promises of Jesus. And when he laid in that cell for years, he still maintained that faith. In my challenging times in my life, he was the one that helped me through stuff from a prison cell. So I brought him home. He wanted to go to our church, Hope City Church in Waterloo. He wanted to go. That was a dream of his. He had known our pastor's wife, my best friend, since she was born. It was super important. In fact, he was the first one to take her to church and introduce her to Jesus. And so it was super important that we got him home, and we did. Shortly after that, we got a box of his stuff. He had it all delivered to me, and his whole world was in 2 boxes. And in it were these 2 pages that were folded in half the long way. And it was written very small, but each page was numbered front and back. And I found the second page first, so I didn't know what it was, but the first one was like number 537. And then the more I looked at it, I'm like, what is this? And I found the first page, and it was called 1,000 Gifts. It was 1,000 things that he was thankful for from inside of that cell. He only made it to number 780 maybe, and the last thing he wrote was getting to go home and fish with Amy and Mike and my grandkids. That was the last thing he wrote. He couldn't write after that because it all went downhill very fast, his sickness. And so it was in that moment of finding those and my kids sitting around me, and my oldest son said, Mom, that's the name of your book. Like, you have to tell this story.
And you did.
Yeah.
So Amy wrote a book called 1,000 Gifts from a 7x10. It's available on Amazon,
Yep.
right?
It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. You can order it on really any place you can buy a book. They've now got it out. I've sold enough now that it's getting bigger. And hopefully that leads to the movie deal that we're hoping on getting.
This is just crazy.
Yeah.
So how much is this book?
I think it's $14.99 online.
Piece of cake. I mean, very affordable.
Yeah.
A very good book. You know, and it talks about not just the story, but it opens people's eyes to what goes on in our prison system.
Yeah.
And you didn't get a chance to share this, but part of your story, his story, was having shingles
Yeah.
for a year before he got
Yeah.
treated for them.
Yeah. Before he
Shingles
was taken out. Yeah.
For a year, you
Yeah.
guys. And just the countless times she would call the prison and begging to speak with somebody, and no return calls were made to her. It opens our eyes in so many different ways. And now they're looking at making a movie, like she said. And what is that?
Yeah. So
That was good.
Pastor Q
It's
actually
Angie's
has
husband.
my best friend's husband. Pastor Q actually had talked about this one time years ago. And now when I do public speaking on my story, I talk about how my worst pain became my greatest purpose. And so I've always worked with people. I've been a director of a youth shelter and worked with kids. I then later on was hired to work in the Department of Corrections to run a women's facility. And today I do treatment. In between a trip and a move to Florida, I'm back in Iowa, and I am doing treatment in a men's correctional facility. And so this is my greatest purpose, to remember that I'm not the judge of anyone. I can only treat you like a human being and empower the people I come in contact with, whether you are, somebody in my facility, or you're somebody on the street, or you're somebody I'm sitting next to at a ball game. Everybody has a purpose, and everybody, whether you're incarcerated or not. And my dad made it very clear, those people that hurt him and the people that spoke life to him, that gave him just a little hope that, yeah, maybe you will get out one day, or that they treated him kindly. I can think of a specific visit where he sat and said, see that lady right there? She's so nice to me. And that just gave me peace. And then you hear the horror stories. And so, it's a book about resiliency. It's a book about, like you said, the people in the system, the things that we don't know or the things that we forget about. It's also a book about remembering to be thankful. If he could be thankful from a 7x10 for 13 years, I can think of something to be thankful on my worst day.
Yeah. And you made it really clear in the book how important his faith was to him. I mean, he wasn't, I don't even know what word I'm looking for, but it was consistently in the forefront of his mind.
All the time.
And, you're not saying he didn't deserve to be incarcerated for what he did.
Absolutely
But you're
not.
saying he deserved, and everybody deserves, to be treated with dignity.
Yes.
And receive the care that they need.
Yes.
and common sense.
Yeah.
You know, did he die with his leg shackled to the bed?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that didn't have to be.
It just,
I'll tell you what, there's 2 things I want to do in this journey. 3. One is my second book that is changes that are happening from within inside. I mean, I know there was federal legislation brought about to have oversight of federal prisons because there's not. And FAM is driving that, the Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and it's past the first step. And so I just think everywhere needs oversight, whether it's Walmart or it's an institution.
Mm-hmm.
We just need just to make sure that we're doing things right. We're not violating people's rights. But there's that, and then there is writing my next book. But there's also, I want to go in one day to Terre Haute into that cell that he spent those 13 years in. I doubt I'll ever get in, but I want to. And I want to with a camera. I want to touch the walls. I want to see the things that he described to me so vividly that I feel like I was already there. I know that place. I know the second floor. I know the size of the window. I know his locker. I mean, those things like that would give, I don't know if it would give me peace or not. But then third, I think the third thing that I want, so the second book, going in there, but then just seeing and being part of change, seeing and helping people, the accountability piece, the oversight of our institutions, and just making sure we're hiring the right people, the people that have empathy. Empathy is a big thing. Like, you have to understand people. Everybody doesn't live or come from the same background that I did or that you did or that people do. Like, we don't know what we would do in certain situations.
and I think you can agree with me. If you heard what some people's lives were like, it would just be like, well, no wonder.
Yeah.
No wonder they turned to drugs.
That's
or
right.
alcohol.
I can't imagine that I wouldn't, hearing some of the things I've heard.
And you and I have heard them.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people look down on them and just, why, just wait.
Yeah.
Just listen to some of these stories and you'll understand.
So true.
And, there, but for the grace of God go I.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Amy, this has been such a unique talk that we've had today. I feel like I know you so much better. I thank you for being really vulnerable because you had a hard life. I mean, you had joy, but I feel like that was always kind of overshadowing.
So I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share it. And, there's often times that I cringe when I think, I got to talk about it, but I live with it. So it's not, I live with him being gone. I live with, his pictures everywhere in my house, his writing. I'll go back and pick a letter out of a tub of thousands and read something and it'll spark another thought. So thank you for letting me refresh and talk about that. I thank the people that work in our institutions that have that great quality of empathy, that can still hold people accountable, but still treat them like human beings. Mm-hmm. I want to just thank people that are having impact in our system, that are making changes that help families. Families are often forgotten from the sentencing process all the way throughout. There are institutions making changes. I can think of an institution that's intentional about having daddy and daughter evenings where the daughters get to come in and spend quality time with their dad. Mm-hmm. And man, what that does for a child. I wasn't a child, I was a young adult when my dad went to prison. But there are often times that I can see impacts that my dad's incarceration has on my children. And so it affects families in more ways, and I could do a whole podcast just on that. Maybe one day. And so, thank you to just people that are having impact, people that are making change, people that are working in the system. But there's one more person that wants to thank you all.
I wanted to get a chance to